I recently helped make an animation called the Combaticons. In making this, I learned a lot, and I wanted to make a video to journal some of my findings. This video specifically will cover animation project organization, steps, and workflow. It will only briefly cover the contents of each step. This one is purely for the soft skills. But there will be other videos covering more technical stuff. Managing a long-term project. If you're going to start a project that you know will be a large undertaking for you and anyone else you work with, then in my opinion you need to do 3 things. Set deadlines. Pace yourself. Pipeline your work. Deadlines become easier to determine with the more experience you have with yourself and your work. But my usual way of determining this is to decide how long it will take and then just double it. Don't estimate based on doing 100% of your free time over an 8-hour workday. Things never work out like that, and you only disappoint yourself. If you need to extend a deadline, then do it, but only do it well before the deadline actually hits. Don't try to scramble to fit it in. If you are working with someone, then be sure to discuss it with them first. Pacing yourself comes with how much time you could spend per day, but more importantly, it means taking breaks when you need to. And even more importantly, it means letting go of something if it's taking too much time. Put a hard limit on how much time you're willing to put into something. This is something that you can only really decide for yourself. If you feel less confident in pacing yourself, then make longer deadlines. Don't shorten them when you have a good day, and don't feel that bad if you miss one. And pipelining makes both of these easier to do and easier to maintain. This is what I'll mainly be going over and explaining in this video. For almost all of the asset creation, I use Blender and Krita. I also use PureRef for references gathering. You can use anything with these methods. This is more for workflow and organization in usage of those tools, whatever tools you may like to use. The key steps in this particular project are planning and scheduling, reference, lookdev, characters, sets and assets, effects, rigging, animation, lighting, rendering, and submission. I've also put in review points, which are the points where you would show material to other people, or just check your own work. These make for good stopgaps to evaluate where you are and where you're going, and to also help with a logical flow of work. This is not to say that you can't model during the rigging phase, or make effects during animation, but having this order in mind keeps things clean and prevents having to rework things later. All these steps will differ based on what your project is. Above all else, take into account your project and its own requirements. It may not fit all of these steps, though this should be generic enough to apply. Planning and scheduling. Luckily, Keyan had provided me with a shot list, which I could work through, and it also gave me a good idea of the time requirements. It also stated what the length of each shots were, and vitally a name pointing to where it comes in the animation. Scene numbers denoting a change in setting or background, and shot denotes a cut in the camera. These also linked to a reference storyboard that had a very rough animatic. This was a rough edit of what was going to be in the final animation. Breaking the animation down like this helps even out the workload. It also keeps you in mind of where things are and where they're going to be. We also had columns to track the status of the work and delivery. It also had the time it needs to be done by and a brief description of the contents of the shot. This was shared with me on Google Docs. This would get updated as the project went on, and if any new shots were added or needed updating, then those changes were seen here. With this done, the next thing I did was make the folder structure and organize my files. This could be neater or a bit more clear, but it helped me enormously when keeping focused on my workflow. I had a folder called Shots, which kept all of the Blender scene files. I had an individual folder for each asset. It would also store the final renders and also play blasts. The all-important references. When starting the project, it was mostly decided that we needed to have a toon-shaded, cartoony style spaceship. We already had a very basic shape and style to go off of from Keyan's original work, and we also had some model sheets made by Shockdeer for the ships to work from as well. If you don't have any model sheets or drawings, then I'd highly encourage you make them. It's easier to iterate on a drawing than it is on 3D object, especially if you want to get something you like. No skill required, even the most basic sketch can help a lot. But to get the exact style, I ended up gathering references from sources that I thought matched. Ota King, examples from Transformers toys, classic ships, and of course, the '86 film. This took a week for the initial gathering, though you will always be looking for references. Especially when you see things out and about, this will happen just throughout the project. The importance of reference gathering cannot be understated. References made the difference between this and this. It's also vital for the next step. Lookdev. Lookdev is the development of a look, meaning that you spend a lot of time, or some very small amount of time, just very roughly trying different styles, different methods, different anything, just to get what you want. It can be done in any way, drawings on flat renders, making a test model, making extremely messy variations in isolation. You could just follow tutorials if you want. You can have everything in a single file or split it out, whatever works for you. The goal here is just to get something that you like. It can be used to determine the real model, or it could just be used to determine how you think something should just look in the end, and none of the actual methods will be used on the actual production model. This should be considered a period of discovery. It's all about finding stuff out. Since once you're locked into your styling and methods, you need to try and keep consistent in the project. That'll save you a lot of headache. It would be much harder to go back and change things after that. I find comfort in knowing that I can scrap all of this and start completely again with a different look on a new project. And if you just keep it consistent now, you'll find out its limitations and its benefits, which will help you in look development in other projects in the future. Consider your project specifically and what it needs doing. Does it have a shading style you need to explore? Will it have textures and maps to achieve this effect? What are you best at, especially when figuring out what you want it to look like? If you find you're best at making a model, then emphasize everything with the modeling. This is the place where you should explore different ways of doing things. Just have fun. This should be the first thing that takes a decent chunk of time. About 4 to 5 weeks. Review points. I've put in review points at key stages. And this isn't a set in stone rule for everyone, but I personally think it's extremely important. I don't want to run away with the modelling process and have a model not look how the team wants it. So make sure to send them in-progress screenshots. This is a great way to change things as you go, rather than pick apart a final item. It saves time and helps show your work and get encouragement as well. I have screenshots for the Discord, with things that I wouldn't have thought to consider to have changed, or that weren't based on the ref. Keyan was also explaining changes that they'd had that were only in their head, that wasn't in the references. This can come from seeing in-progress designs, and it shouldn't reflect on you. It's good to just take it at face value and not blame anything on yourself. There are things that I've presented that I felt was substandard, but when showing it helped me see ways to improve it. It's all part of the creative process. Characters. In this case, I didn't do a lot of real characters, but the ships were such a big part of it and had such extensive rigging that I would have considered them basically hero characters. When I had the look done, I would then model the ships. I would model in order of importance. If something was less likely to be seen, I wouldn't worry too much about it. The fighter ships were going to be duplicated a lot, so their models had to be deliberately simple and lower poly. Here is where you would have any special considerations for your models. So think about their application before you dive in, just making them as good as they can be, and then it ends up being impossible to rig or impossible to animate. When you make the asset, be sure to have only one asset or character or set per file, and version these up accordingly. You want to have the model file done and then appended or linked to a scene file, or save it as a new file for rigging or so on. If any large changes happen, or you make a big leap in progress, be sure to make a file save as, and give it a higher version name. This makes it so you have a history and can fall back on anything should anything get corrupted, or you change, or you just want to go back and get something that you made in the beginning, and then use it again now. The time taken here will change vastly between projects, but here it was about 2 months. Assets and sets. Assets are much like characters, but with no real need to animate or have them super detailed or put in extreme close-ups. They also probably wouldn't need rigging, but that can vary. I only really did a few, but the rules are the same with these. Keep them in separate files and version them up. And if you want to check scale, make sure to just have a basic cube in each scene and then check against them. And then if they're going to be more intimately used, like something in the hand, append the file and check against the hand, just before you save, or append them both into a blank file and check it there. This too varies in amount of time needed, but this one took about a month. The big difference here with effects is making them modular. A lot of the effects needed to be used all over the place, so I wanted to get them to fit a sort of drag and drop utility. It's important to look at the effects alongside models and make sure that they fit and that they work well with each other. It's also important to make sure that they are pre-animated, so it takes as little time as possible when you drag and drop them in. Making them modular also ups their usage. You could easily swap your usage for one and the other and have it change vastly from shot to shot. This will also take about a month. Rigging. In this project, I didn't have anyone else that would be using these rigs. If I did, I would liaise with them in order to find out how intuitive a rig would need to be, or what rigs they were used to. If there was an animator as well, I would have also asked them what rigs they would have wanted. Sometimes the animator may need a specific kind of control that you didn't know about, and it'd be important to find this out before you rigged. But in this case, I was the only rigger and animator, so I got free rein. But I did try to make them intuitive, so anyone in the future who would use these files would be able to just open and check. Rigging should usually be done after all the models were finished and all the textures and shading are done. This way you can see the deformation errors. You can't really review a rig unless you have, say, a specific need to have a door open, or the team picture something happening like the turrets rotating, and then you have to add that in later. But you can still make a few pose tests and show them. This step took a few weeks. Animation. This is where a lot of the elements come together. Something I did to speed up the setup of these shots was make a base file with all of the render settings and the camera setup and the resolution, and I had the basic camera rig as well, which were all just in a single file. And then whenever I'd make a new shot, I'd just copy this file, save as, version up, change the name, good to go. This saves you the headache of having to set it up each and every time. When animating in a shot format, you could do many things like break the rig, have it appended to a path, a cluster of ships, have all of them follow the same path, duplicate the ships multiple times, or have them constrained to other ones. This is where you could be a bit messy. You could do whatever you need for the shot. Breaking stuff to allow the shot to look better from specific angles can be seen as cheating, but this does allow for the freedom to cheat if there is no other option. Also be sure to make frequent, just basic shader renders with a lower resolution of whatever you make, so that you can see it in full motion outside of the viewport, and also so you can log it and keep track of what you've made. It also is a good way of giving other people in your team a look at what you're doing. Lighting. Lighting could happen throughout the shot animation, especially if the lights are going to be moving, but generally each shot will be unique. In many cases, I was able to just get away with a sun lamp that drives the toon shading. You could have a global HDRI in your base scene, or a different lighting setup for each asset. Just anything to keep it consistent between shots. Rendering. Rendering only happens after everything else is done, or you think you've got to the point where you're done with a shot and you want to see how it renders. If you followed the shot setup base file, you can just hit render. But if you do have some special shots with mixed 2D, 3D composite, then you can comp as well. But you may want to find out if the team wants to comp in the compositing software afterwards, or you want to do it inside your software as well. I also kept a rigid naming structure, so that any of the files I made would be easily distinguishable from shot, and also what kind of contents they had on them. It also helps with render file sends. We made the choice of using image sequences. This is rendering a single image per frame in a PNG format. This is because PNGs are lossless, and it also means that you can send the file with no compression and no interpolated frames, meaning that it's a bit more clunky than sending a single movie file, but it means it can be transferred with no image quality loss, and also if something happens like you broke the render or your computer crashes or an upload stops halfway through, then you can keep the frame you're on and then just start from there. You don't have to do the whole thing over again. And when it's with small shots, the amount of files doesn't tend to be that much. Which brings us on to submission. We sent the files using Google Drive. I would upload them, and then the team could download them from wherever they were. Submission could happen at any time. You could either do all of your shots and make sure they're all finished, or you could send one shot at a time over the course of a month. Sometimes you may need to go back and re-render, and then submit again. Find out what's best for your team. And those were the broad steps. There are exceptions, and there are situations that can happen that will throw wrenches into anything you're doing. But if you keep the broad structure there, it will help greatly with organizing and getting your project over the finish line. There is no magic bullet to completing a project, but I believe it comes from doing a small amount of work every day, and having a list like this that stops you having to work from a blank canvas really helps. At least that's how I find it. I hope that if you do adopt this, that it does help.